I shouldn't say what I was going to say live on air.
You can say whatever you'd like to.
I was going to say thanks everybody for skipping the shit show to come to the real show. But I shouldn't say that. Okay, sorry, good people. What's that? That's good. Okay.
Would you take our picture before?
Yeah.
I'll forget before we. I know we're live, but there we go.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and he's going to take our picture here.
There we go. Always trust the photographer. There we go.
All right. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. It is such a treat to have Ace Atkins back with us. Seems like it's been a long time.
It's been, I guess,
3 years?
3 years, yeah. I can't believe that. But you and I stay in touch all the time, so I feel like no time has passed.
I know.
That's what happens with good friends and people that you've known for such a long time. And you meet up and just start back the conversation you had from the very last time.
I know. It's like old home week or whatever. It's like, Ace and I go way back in the bookstore goes way back to book one. And it's been such a treat to watch his career, just the arc and blossom. And
I think I say this every time, but I'll bring it up again. But when I put my very first book out, which was very modestly published, the first person in the book business that I heard from that had read the book was Patrick. He said it was the worst book he had ever read in his life. He said, I think you need to rethink your career.
Well, I was in the corner in my playpen
Yeah, right.
all those years ago, and
25 years ago.
25 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, gosh. It does indeed. You guys are in for a real treat with this book. Wow. And there's some unexpected stuff in here, that people, at least up until this point, haven't associated with you, with your voice. There's international intrigue. There's an element of domestic suspense.
Yeah.
But then also there's this great old school PI named Porter Hayes. So tell us a little bit, this is an ambitious book for you. I remember when you were talking about it a couple of years ago that you were kind of working on it. Tell us a little bit about what inspired it.
Sure. I mean, for this book, for those of you who've read the Quinn Colson books, you guys know the Quinn books, really loved writing about that world, writing about where I'm from in the Deep South. But after doing that for over 10 years, and I'm still going to go back to it. I still love writing those books. But I wanted to kind of break some new ground and tell a story that I've been wanting to write for some time with some characters that I was very passionate about and really not have any boundaries. And that's what this book was about. It is exactly as Patrick said. It is a domestic suspense. Sure, it's about a woman whose husband goes missing and what has happened to him and who is his identity. It is a classic hard-boiled private eye book with a character named Porter Hayes, who's a 70-something, black detective that has been working in Memphis since the early 1970s. It is an international spy caper. It involves, some very unsavory Russians and arms dealers and that kind of thing. So I didn't really have any barriers on what I could do. I had been writing about rural Mississippi. I'd been writing about Memphis for years, but it would always be, kind of a satellite location. But for this, there's, scenes that happen in Paris and in Dubai and, all kinds of locations. And it was fun. It was kind of very freeing. That's how this came about. Just like open the gates and, entertain myself. And that's always been the theory with my writing, which is if I entertain myself, hopefully, I'll entertain you guys as well.
Right. And, music, of course, goes throughout all of Ace's books in some way or another from the very beginning. And tell us a little bit about the song "Don't Let the Devil Ride" and how it kind of, how it inspired you.
Well, this book was written under a different title. This was written under there's a little bit, which we'll talk about the characters later, but there's a little bit of a thread in this, which of course, when you're writing about Memphis, you have to talk about Elvis. So this was written under the title "Suspicious Minds," and so that's where that. But we started talking about it and doing something that was maybe something a little bit edgier that people that weren't familiar with that song, how that would be. And there was a moment in the book where I'd always loved this song. It's a classic gospel song, and in fact, people don't even know who wrote it. It's been recorded by numerous artists. I don't know how far it goes back. There's all kinds of versions of it. There's rock and roll versions and gospel versions and soul versions and all kind of stuff. But I always liked it, and once we decided that this was going to be the title, there's a really horrendous, awful thing happens in the book, and when that happens, that's the point where one of the characters said, you always have to be careful, don't let the devil ride. And I was like, I knew exactly when we decided the title where that was going to come in.
Yeah, I looked it up, and I don't know if this is, if it's like a traditional gospel tune or.
I don't think it's traditional. I just think it's old. I just think it's been around.
Somebody claims that the Reverend Orvis Mays wrote it in 1968.
That sounds about right to me. Sounds about right.
Yeah, there's that wonderful kind of combination of gospel and blues, which I know, so much of that soul music from that era, the Stax and all that stuff. I know you're a big fan.
I mean, that was everything. And so for me, getting inspired about the book, you have those places that you go to. And for me, it was soul music. And soul music in the 1960s was so powerful, so incredible. I mean, for me, the best music ever made. I mean, I love everything about it. Now, have any of you guys seen the documentary about Stax Records? It's on HBO. It's really tremendous. It's a nice retelling of the whole Stax story. And you guys are familiar with Otis Redding. You guys know Sam and Dave, the Booker T and the MGs, Johnny Taylor. Do you know these people? All came out of this record company called Stax. And if there was going to be a soundtrack, for "Don't Let the Devil Ride," it certainly probably would have been on Stax Records. And so when I was writing this, when I'd write the Quinn Colson books, for me, so much of it was classic country, and so to get in the mindset for this, it was all classic soul.
And let's just talk a little bit about. I just want to have my little notes here because the narrative structure of the book is really interesting too. It's told mainly from four people with a couple of sidelines. So it's Addison McKellen who opens the book, and then you mentioned Porter Hayes, who's this awesome character. I know you're a fan, and this connects you to the 1970s, which I know is,
Yeah, we've talked so much about how, with filmmaking and music and just aesthetically, how much the 70s is just one of the greatest decades of, inspiration.
And even though this book, and we got to be careful not to go too much in spoilers and things. I don't want to, say everything, but give you a taste. Even though it's definitely a book set contemporary times with a lot of modern stuff, there are elements of it when I was reading them, I'm like, okay, there's some 70s. It felt at times like a 70s action novel.
I mean, I think for me, Porter Hayes, again, he's not the main character. I mean, it's not like, reading a Spencer book where, you're only latching on to Spencer and following his, point of view. He's one of the characters. But he's definitely a guy that was inspired by Shaft and some blaxploitation films. And I always hated it with, I loved Richard Roundtree. And this book right now is in very high development for a TV show, and it's going to be a Porter Hayes TV show. It's not going to be, so part of this will be the show, but mainly about the character Porter Hayes. And when I was writing this, I kept on thinking, boy, Richard Roundtree, if we could get him, and he still looked great, and he'd passed away, but he would have been great. But I always felt like with Shaft, instead of recasting Shaft, I would have liked to seen Shaft as an older man, and I would have liked to seen, why did they wouldn't let Richard Roundtree? I mean, I don't think Sam Jackson was a hell of a lot younger than Richard Roundtree, but I would have loved to have seen him play an older version of Shaft, and that's where he came in, and that was such a big inspiration, and that's really kind of who Porter Hayes is like an older Shaft.
Right, and then you've got this wonderful surprise. As I mentioned, it's a combination of all these different elements, but deeply rooted in Memphis.
Yeah.
It's a Memphis novel, a novel about Memphis today and also the past. And so you got this wonderful character named Joanna Grayson and her daughter Tippy. Can you talk about them? And
Yeah, and again, this is a novel of characters. This is this is all connected through characters. There's story, there's something that we're following through, and there's a big mystery. There's an element of what we're following and how these stories are going to connect. But everything started with these core characters, and so one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character, along with Addison, whose husband is missing, and Porter Hayes, who's the legendary private detective, there is Joanna Grayson. And Joanna Grayson was kind of an it girl in the 1960s. She would have made a few films in Great Britain. She would have been part of the swinging London scene in the 1960s, and then she would have been brought over to Hollywood. And her first Hollywood film was making a movie with Elvis Presley, and made a film called Easy Come, Easy Go, which is definitely one of the worst Elvis movies ever made. It's about Elvis being a scuba diver, and he's looking for sunken treasure, and I think there's pirates in it, and it has some of the worst songs ever. But because of that, she's always linked to Elvis. And I saw this many times because I live like 45 minutes outside the city, and you constantly would see every year with what we call Death Week, which is around when Elvis died, when people come for the candlelight vigil, is you have people that come in and give talks that were former co-stars, or they had played with Elvis, or they knew Elvis, or they were a neighbor, or whatever. And so that's who Joanna is. Joanna is somebody that you would see at Death Week. She had actually moved with her young daughter to Memphis because she thought she could kind of still ride on the coattails of just the fact that she had made a movie with Elvis, 30 years ago. And she does, like, she's published a self-published, or has a self-published book called One Night with You, the Joanna Grayson story. And so she's signing books and hustling them over on Elvis Presley Boulevard, and she's doing that kind of stuff. But I love Joanna. I mean, she was so much fun to write.
yeah, I mean, she's such a survivor. And
That's it, man. That's exactly what she is. She's a survivor. That's who she is.
and it allows you to kind of go into this really weird kind of, as you say, very kitschy. Anybody even narrowly associated with Elvis has a bankable thing,
Yeah, I mean, there's people right now. I mean, last night this morning, I was staying at the guest house at Graceland. I was staying at the hotel right next to Graceland, and people are coming out, and there's always something happening. There's always somebody making an appearance, and somebody who played at Elvis's band in 1974, and they were part of that. And and unfortunately, those people are getting less and less. There's fewer people with direct connections with Elvis.
Any of the band still around?
Yeah, I think Ronnie Tutt, his longtime drummer, passed away. But James Burton, who was his legendary guitar player, he's still around. I think Jerry Schiff, the bass player, but they're not playing as much as they used to. These guys are in their 80s now.
Yeah, Burton is amazing.
Oh my God, one of the greatest.
Yeah, Scotty Moore.
Oh yeah, and Scotty Moore passed away. I got to see him play live though.
Did you really?
Yeah, there was a moment. This is so Memphis. So we have a place in Memphis called the Pyramid, and the Pyramid, of course, is to capitalize on Memphis, of course, being the Egyptian city. And so they built this huge pyramid where the basketball team used to play, but they also would host music venues. And so in 2003, I went to see what was the 25th anniversary of Elvis's death. And it was the young band, and it was Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, and they did all the That's All Right Mama, and they did all the original stuff. And then it switched over, and it was Elvis's TCB band, and it was James Burton and Ronnie Tutt and Jerry Schiff and Glenn Hardin, and
How many of those guys were in the '68 comeback special kind of lineup?
Well, it's kind of sad. We talk about Elvis all night.
Indulge us, yeah.
Well, part of the whole thing with the '68 comeback special was that they got his old band. I mean, because people don't really realize that Elvis worked many years before he became famous. So, he hit everything in 56, 57, but he had traveled every, small town and every small town in the South and Louisiana and, Mississippi and Alabama and down in Florida, and gone all over the place before he really made it big. He had gone to all these different places. But I'm sorry, what was your question about the
I was just wondering if the guys in the band were, if it was a kind of a hybrid of
Yeah, no,
old
I'm
and the
sorry.
new.
68 Comeback. So in 68 Comeback, that was kind of the idea, is to bring, he had made this,
Scotty
started
was
off
there.
and made some good movies, but then, slowly through his association with the Colonel, they got worse and worse and worse. And some of them are just absolutely horrible. And then, of course, as they called it, I think it was, Singer Presents Elvis, but now we think of it as the 68 Comeback Special, is they got his original guitar player, Scotty Moore, drummer DJ Fontana, and they all sat around in that famous thing where you see Elvis in the black leather and he's sitting in the round and he's playing. And for people who don't know Elvis or aren't Elvis fans, if you don't watch that and then become an Elvis fan, I cannot help you. But yeah, and so kind of the sad part of that, Scotty Moore always talked about, was he said after they had done that and just knocked it out of the park and just had so much fun, and you could see Elvis had that repossessed energy of playing music again, and doing the stuff. As he told me, he's like, okay, we're going to go out on the road and we're going to come back, we're going to make some albums together, and he said he never heard from Elvis ever again. Wow. And I think that was less about Elvis and more about the Colonel. But
Yeah.
if you guys don't, I mean, I'm sure most of you know the 68 Comeback Special, but just pull it up on YouTube. I think it's all there. It's fantastic.
And he was, of course, worried that he'd become irrelevant, with the late 60s.
Oh, yeah.
The young hippie culture.
Yeah.
And so unapologetically 50s, the full deal.
Yeah, I mean, that was like the quote John Lennon when they came to visit. I don't know if he really said it or not, but he said, Elvis is dead. Where he felt like it was all over, because there was such a thing, I think, with he was such a dangerous. We'll talk about my book in a second, but let's talk about Elvis. Is that in the 50s he was such a dangerous, edgy, kind of like a punk rocker. And then when he comes back from the army, there was such a thing an idea to kind of neuter him and make him, cut his hair and cut his sideburns and make him look more and sing more kind of like, more
kind of a crooner.
Yeah, more of a crooner. And, he did a Welcome Back special with Frank Sinatra. And I love Frank Sinatra, but they were trying to say, oh, well, that was a different period, but now Elvis is going to be something else. And then 68 was like, no, this is who I am. This is who I am. And I think, it just was fantastic.
And then Vegas years ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both good
anyway,
and bad.
Sorry to digress so much into Elvis, but
we'll start with wise men are handing out scarves right now to everybody. Welcome tonight. I'll do it.
Damn, it is a fascinating story, isn't it? Jeez.
It is. Did you? Sorry, I'm not going to let you. We'll talk about Elvis afterwards.
Okay. No more Elvis, but
there's a lot of. I will promise you, there's a lot of Elvis in the book.
Yeah. A lot of Elvis, and but I mean, he's such a part of Memphis lore, down to its core.
Yeah,
Sun Records days.
It's just the ghost of Elvis is everywhere.
Right.
Like I said, this morning I woke up and I'm in the hotel that's owned by Graceland right next door, and you're just seeing these throngs of people coming from all over the world just to kind of be close to Elvis. And
it's such a kind of a weird American story.
It is the quintessential American story. Yeah.
Anyway, back to your book. Let's talk. Okay, so we mentioned Addison.
That is my book. Elvis is there.
Yeah, Addison McKellen, Porter Hayes, Joanna, and then we have Gaultier, International Man of Mystery.
That's a character who's probably most like me. If I put a character in the book, like who are you in the book? I did a book signing some years ago in I think it was at Cleveland. I was doing like the Cleveland Library, and it was a good sized amount of people, and there was somebody sitting in the audience, and the guy kind of had a frown on his face. He was like looking at me, and I started talking. And he said, because you guys know the Quinn Colson books, and the character is a deputy sheriff and former Army Ranger, and that's his whole story, and kind of a Buford Pusser kind of character. And he's like, "Were you an Army Ranger?" And I said, "No, I wasn't an Army Ranger." "Well, are you a sheriff?" And I was like, "No." And I said, "I'm not. I'm also in my books. I'm not a 15-year-old girl. I am also not, a madam of a truck stop house of prostitution. I'm not an international, or a Memphis drug lord. I'm all these people." But yeah, Gautier was a lot of fun. He was one of those characters. You hear authors say this, but it's really true. Where I started writing him, he's a Frenchman and he's an arms dealer, and a lot of his scenes are set in Paris, and then by happenstance or circumstances of the book, ends up in Memphis, and but he was a lot of fun to write. He was one of those characters that just shows up in one scene, and you don't necessarily think that, he's necessarily going to be part of the overall story. But I had so much fun writing him. He ends up becoming a major part of the story.
So how much can you really tell us about the plot of the book?
I could tell you everything. I mean, again, this is, it's the
Not
character, it's the
everything.
characters. I mean, I'm not writing the Da Vinci Code, so it's not like, I don't write run and gasp books, as I call them. It's not like, and I talk about this book, and to, when I would do sound bites, like I'm on television yesterday and I'm talking to, in some ways I would talk about the book. It might sound a certain way to certain people. It might have a different feel if I'm only telling about one facet of the book. If I just sit here and I talk to you about Porter Hayes, the classic detective, you're going to have an idea of it's a hard-boiled detective novel. If I start talking about Addison McKellar, you're going to have the idea it's a domestic suspense. But overall, the book begins with Addison, and it begins in Addison's voice. Addison is late 30s, early 40s. She is a wealthy woman that lives in a very neat, old, historic neighborhood of Memphis. She has a beautiful old English Tudor house that's, probably 100 years old. She has two kids. She has a young son and she has a young teenage daughter. And she has a husband who's very well respected in the community, a guy named Dean McKellar, who owns a construction company, and he's a member of what we have in Memphis. We have these crews, kind of like in New Orleans, where people are part of these, like, society crews. And anyway, everything's going fine, and all of a sudden, he goes on a business trip. He's working on a new project in London, and she doesn't hear back from him. And it's like 2 days, and she's calling. This book is set in 2010, and she's texting him. She reaches out to his personal secretary, not getting anything. She can't get any answers. And after like 52 calls, she finally goes down. This is all in the first chapter. She goes down to his office that's in this old historic building in Memphis called the Cotton Exchange Building. And, she's busy. She's a stay-at-home mom, or busy mom. She's got a lot of stuff going on. She's getting her kids to school and that kind of stuff. So she hasn't been to the office in quite some time. And she walks in there, and now it's an interior design firm, and nobody in there knows who Dean McKellar is. Nobody knows what McKellar Construction is. Nobody knows anything about this. And so at that point, she kind of becomes unhinged, and she ends up demanding to get some answers, and the police have to come. They have to take her away. It's very humiliating. Her car is towed, and it's like the worst day ever. And then we go, start over, and then we meet Joanna, and we see Joanna's situation, and where Joanna's hustling and surviving. And Joanna is in her late 60s. She's got a daughter in her 20s, and she's doing these kind of, humiliating events, talking about her times with Elvis, where, people don't necessarily ask her about some of the decent movies she made. They want to know about, did you ever meet Elvis's monkey, and things like that. And but that's how she, that's how she lives.
And when we meet her, as you say, she seemingly has it all. She's also from a pretty old, established family, right, in Memphis. Yeah, and her dad is
Yeah, and not an old money family. I
no.
mean, there's like old money in Memphis, and I think that's what was so important to her, is that she got into like an old established, married somebody that had money, got to be a member of the Memphis Country Club and all that kind of stuff. Because her father, what we learned when you get the books, when you first meet her, you think she's a typical, wealthy white woman that's very demanding and this kind of stuff. But when you meet her, what you end up later finding out is she's actually Lebanese. Her father is a big part of the Lebanese community. He owns a restaurant that has been in their family for a long time, and he's a kind of a local character, and he may or may not have had a past dealing in kind of illegal activities, like as a bookie and doing some kind of unsavory things. And it's really through her father, who's this guy named Sammy Hassan, who's very ill, and he's actually terminally ill. Does he say, look, Addison, I can help you with this. There's a man that can find out some answers for you. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but if he's still alive, this is the guy who can help you uncover what's about your husband. And that's where he introduces Addison, his daughter, to Porter Hayes.
Right. It seems like Addison, is she senses that that something's wrong. I could be reading between the lines a little bit, but
Well, and I think that some people, when I talk about that story about the husband, is you might have the idea. I'm going to stand up if that's okay, because I've been on a damn flight. Is that some people might have the idea that that she's heartbroken and missing her husband and where. I mean, the truth of it is, she's been married for 15 years. She has 2 kids. She kind of is not crazy in love with her husband, So it's really kind of a thing of just being pissed off as, who in the hell did I marry, and who's this guy that's in my bed every day, and is he lying to me, and what's happening? So that gives me the freedom as the writer to write more of a comedic novel, and I think that's what I would try to tell you guys. It's not, woman in the window or whatever. It's hopefully a lot of fun. Yeah.
And then, he proceeds to gaslight her in certain ways.
He's a terrible husband. I think
Yeah.
there was another book. There was another book. He's an awful person. There was another book that came out. It was a big hit. Somebody brought in and said, well, it's a similar premise, about a husband going missing and a wife trying to find out, who is the husband, and, that kind of thing. But I think eventually that the husband was actually a great person, and he had very good reasons for going missing, but he actually, is a really, solid individual. That's not the case with my book. This guy is the worst husband of all time. I'm not giving anything away. He's a mercenary. He's a gun runner. He's a con artist. We don't even know his name. He is a killer. I mean, he's done all kinds of bad things. So
swell guy.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to. Have you been reading at all from the book?
No.
Okay.
But I mean, I can.
Tempted.
Or you can read.
Well, we're all adults here, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and everybody online. All right. Can you give him Porter Hayes' entrance?
Sure. Absolutely.
Into the book. It's very memorable. I think you'll like it.
Yeah, I gotta. We're all adults here. So this is Porter Hayes, and again, we've just met Addison, and her situation has been laid out with essentially what I've just told you. And this is Porter Hayes in his voice. He said, more than half of Porter Hayes' business involved preachers I'll say effing, when they should have been praying. He's been employed by preachers' wives, jilted husbands, deacons, and assistant pastors, wondering just why the hell was the head pastor so-and-so charging $1,000 at the Peabody, that's a famous hotel, for the ultimate duck experience that included dinner at Chez Philippe and a complimentary bottle of Corbel. It was a damn cliche as old as Methuselah's great-grandmama, but it was a core part of Hayes' investigations, a business he'd been running out of his downtown office since 1971. He developed such a talent for it that he could write right down the middle of the Kojic convention. You guys know what Kojic is. Kojic is a very powerful and somewhat well-known black Christian organization, Church of God in Christ, that has had some political problems. Right in the middle of the big Kojic convention, and the sanctified congregation would part as if he was Moses strutting down the soul train line. Nobody wanted Porter Hayes on their tail.
That's his entrance into the novel. It's very awesome. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your research for this book. Getting into, because there's also this angle that's really great about the underground religious relics racket.
That was really the only research that I did. Memphis is. I live in Oxford, Mississippi, which is it's where the University of Mississippi is. It's a very literary town with a lot of writers and that kind of thing. But it's right outside Memphis. So Memphis is like my home city. Oxford's my hometown, but Memphis is my home city. So I didn't really do a lot of research. I really didn't. But the religious relics racket, I did have to do a lot for that.
Right. Can we get into that at all, or is that kind of a spoiler? You have this great character who also has some time on.
Yeah, we can talk about the character. I don't want to tell too much about.
Let's talk about Leslie Grimes.
Yeah, Leslie Grimes is kind of he's obsessed with collecting artifacts of different things, and a lot of that plays into kind of my Maltese Falcon complex. What are people looking for, and what are people willing to kill for and fight for? So there are important relics that this guy Leslie Grimes will do. But Leslie Grimes is kind of you know, very kind of milk toast, very pious, kind of religious guy that owns this chain of multi-million-dollar religious themed craft stores that are all around the Mid-South. And he's like the fourth wealthiest guy in Arkansas, of course, behind the people who own Walmart. And he spends his money.
Tomes and treasures.
Tomes and treasures
That's
is his business that has nothing to do with any other business that may or may not be like that. And Leslie Grimes really will do anything that he can to facilitate some things getting to Memphis. And that's where all these characters with Addison and Porter and Dean McKellar and Gautier, the arms dealer, and some Russian thugs. It is, I think everything for me at some point goes back to the Maltese Falcon. It's such a formative book, I think, for all crime writers.
Well, and there's one of Dean McKellar's kind of pet names is Peter Collinson.
Yeah.
And is that
You're the only person.
am I the only nerd who knows?
You are the only nerd that gets that, besides me, the fellow nerd here, getting that. So.
And that was a pen name that Dashiell Hammett wrote under when he wrote for. I don't know. Was it Peter? I know the last name.
It was Peter.
It was
Peter
Peter
Collinson. Yeah, for
Collinson.
Black Mask. That was one of his pseudonyms.
He published in Black Mask. Yeah.
One person gets it. Nobody else got that.
I don't know. Well, what else would you like to tell us about the book?
I don't know. I mean, we can ask you guys if you guys have
Yeah.
any questions, and
Anybody
we can
have-
talk about that. And
For sure. Christina.
Why did you choose 2010?
very good question. Why did I write a book in 2010, near history? Well, there's a couple reasons. Porter Hayes is a character that I have been wanting to write for quite some time, and he has a very specific timeline. He was in Vietnam. He was a guy that was a police officer at the time that Martin Luther King was killed. He started his business in the early 1970s. We're going to backtrack to Elvis. He was actually a good friend of Elvis's. During Elvis's crime-fighting years in the early 70s, he would have hung out with Porter Hayes. And so I wanted Porter to be in his 70s. I wanted him to be in his 70s. And that was one reason. But also there's a fair amount of desperation in this book with characters dealing with fallout from the recession. And so it was a good time. And also dealing with mercenaries and soldiers for hire and kind of like Dean McKellar essentially runs a group like Blackwater. And if you guys remember Blackwater, the shady paramilitary group, that's essentially, he's like an Eric Prince type character. And that was very 2010. Yeah, thank you for saying that.
No, but you know what I mean? Because I'm always like, why do people say it at certain times? And I just wonder if for readers, it's.
I don't think a lot of readers maybe even knew. I think that you have to really kind of pay attention to little bits and pieces of it. In some ways, I also like the idea of writing it because there's so much in our society and with storytelling right now that's cell phone based, and so much with social media and things like that. And I wanted to escape that a little bit too, because there would have been, in realism, there would have been a social media aspect to it. And so I like being kind of a little bit in the past.
Was that the cutoff kind of point before?
Yeah, I think I forget when the first iPhones were introduced. It was right about that time. Yeah, it screwed us all.
Right.
As I'm about to post our pictures of Patrick and I on my Instagram account.
It's a miracle.
Yeah.
I hate it.
And
It's a miracle.
Facebook and
Yeah.
the app formerly known as Twitter.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you wanted to write about this character. How long have you had that thought?
These are good questions. Thank you. The question is how long have I had that thought about this character? Thank you for asking that. I have had the thought about this character, honestly, for quite some time, probably for 10, 12 years. And for those of you who've been here before, you know that I've written books I wrote a novel that was about Dashiell Hammett. I wrote a book that was about Machine Gun Kelly in the 1930s. I wrote a book about a sin town in Alabama in the 1950s. And so I was really on a historic track and doing that kind of stuff. And I had an editor at Putnam who's a legend. He was actually the guy named Neil Nyren, and Neil was the editor for Clive Cussler and Tom Clancy. He was the first guy to publish. And he said, Ace, I think really break you out if we do a series. He goes, series is really, he said, people love to hear about the Fatty Arbuckle scandal of 1921, but he said a contemporary novel. So I had the idea of two different characters, two different ideas if you're going to write a series. And one of them was Quinn Coulson, and it was a very rural based, very much kind of going back to the idea of like exploitation films and Burt Reynolds movies and stuff that I really loved. But also, thinking about movies like Shaft and more urban based stories and a character like Porter Hayes. And it was kind of between the two. It was essentially kind of like the idea of a city mouse versus the country mouse, what I was going to do. And eventually went with Quinn Coulson. I've written so far 11 books in that. But I had always thought about Porter Hayes, and I always thought about him. And he became so deeply ingrained in my mind. Every time I'm in Memphis, I know where he's like Spencer. He's like the Spencer of Memphis. I know where his office is. I know where he goes to get his coffee. I know all about his connection with his wife when she sang for Stax Records. So I think that time allowed that idea to marinate, in a very good way.
Well, when you first thought of that, then did you write it down to remember that, or is it just there?
It's just
You
there.
go back to it.
Yeah, it's just there. I actually have. I mean, this is probably more information that you guys really want to know. But when I was working on after I finished the last Spencer book, I did 10 Spencer books, and it was. I love doing it. I love that character, and I always will. But at some point when you write, you're working for an estate. Then those it's never your own. So whether you write, The Big Sleep or Maltese Falcon, if you're doing it with other people's characters, you don't have any kind of ownership and that kind of thing. And that, as an author, there's only so long you want to do that. So I think 10 was a nice round number. I contributed, paid respect for Parker and was able to do that. But when I finished that last book, I actually started writing a different book, and I got about halfway through, or about a third of the way through, and that was a book with Porter Hayes that was set at a different period of time. But as editorial conversations came through, and what we decided ultimately would be the next book after writing these two series for 10 years. It became a different story, but that other story is very much alive, and that other story probably will be a book down the road. It won't be my next book, but it'll probably be a book down the road.
Will this then go into a series?
Well,
These characters?
I don't think these characters. Well, some of these. Well, when you finish it, you'll see there's not a lot of these characters who's going to survive, but there's certainly, I think certainly with, I would like to see there's another novel, at least one more novel with Porter Hayes. I don't think it's a series, but I think it's a prequel.
Yeah, it would be kind of a limited time offer on him time-wise, right?
Well,
Unless you go back.
It would be going back. It's going back.
Yeah, that
and
would
so and that's the book that I've actually was writing takes place 20 years before the events of this book.
Oh, wow,
Do you
cool.
already have other characters that you're thinking about, maybe in the future to write about?
Well, I mean, I'm more than deep into the next book for next year, and
But I mean, other totally different characters.
oh yeah, no,
You're always thinking.
always.
I have
Always.
a breakfast group that we meet often, and I'm always astounded at how writers come up with the different ideas all of the time.
Yeah.
And they're not readers, and I said it's just it's mind-boggling.
I forgot there was some writer. I forget some famous writer. I was reading an interview, and he was talking about the fact that you have you're hearing voices in your head, and you have all these voices in your head, and there's such a thin line between that and insanity. And so I get paid for it, and I've made a career of it for over 25 years. But thankfully, I love when those voices and those characters come to visit me. But yeah, no, I've got plenty of ideas. And as you get to be an older writer, as I've been doing this for 25 years, you're very selective about what's the next story I'm going to write, because yeah, yeah, for sure. I think now I did actually for quite some time. I did 2 books a year, and that was a pretty intense schedule. But for right now, yeah, book a year. So hopefully you guys will see me back about the same.
Do you have certain times of day that you fashion out the time to do this?
I have an office, and I live, like I said, I live in Oxford, Mississippi. I have this office in this old historic building, and it's populated with a lot of lawyers and that kind of thing. And I go in there, and it's I go to work. right across the street. Yeah, which is because that's the bar. The city grocery is the bar. Yeah, and occasionally that is what I would call that the satellite office. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Too much fan.
No, no, it's fine. It's fine.
I liked your short story ebook, Havana Run.
Oh, thanks.
Think about making this a full novel, because that whole story about Camilo Cienfuegos, 92, 93,
Yeah.
he's still alive.
Oh, yeah.
Alive, like Elvis.
Yeah,
But
and that story was set a little bit in the past too.
did you hear a lot of, even like when you're at the Tampa Tribune, like maybe 35 years later, did you still hear any talk about
So we're talking about. I did a short story. It's kind of like between a short story and a novella. It's about 50, 60 pages, and it was for Amazon. And it was an original story, and it came out a few months ago. And they just let me. They said, "Hey, what do you want to write? You write a story for us." And even though I guess most of my books are, except for the Hammett book, are all very tied to the South. I spent a lot of time as a reporter in Florida and in Tampa, and so I like writing about Florida books, and not necessarily Florida like crazy Florida man books, but like Florida history. And so this story is about these two. It was a kind of I'll answer your question. This book it's a short story called The Havana Run, and in my mind, it was an alternative reality that if I had not gotten out of the newspaper business when I did, where would I have ended up? And that was probably for me living at some kind of rundown hotel down in Pinellas County, Florida, and then probably working for some lawyers like some of my friends are doing, trying to eke out a living. And this story is about two guys, and I've spent some time in Havana. I love Cuban culture. I love Miami. I love Cuban food. I love all that. And they end up going, and this book that story was probably set around 2011, 2012. And they go down to Cuba for a job for a guy that lives in this. I'm giving you way more background, but a guy lives in a Cuban community called Ybor City, and he hires these two out of work journalists to go to Cuba to retrieve this thing and to get paid $10,000. And then of course, everything turns to hell at that point.
Is there a connection to the White Shadow kind of backstory?
I kept on trying to. White Shadow was a book that I did that was a kind of, I guess you call it like a Florida noir. That was a truth-based story, one of my truth-based books that was set in Tampa in the 1950s. And I kept on thinking there was a link, but no, I could never quite make the link happen. I think it's just happened years later. But yeah, like Cienfuegos is one of the forgotten revolutionaries, and it is true. I can't tell you too much because then it gives away the whole story. But yeah, a big connection. Yeah, that is it. People have theorized that. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yes, sir. Mm. Mm.
Whether you tried to, I don't know, seed next book,
Yeah.
and you're writing a series as opposed to writing a single book, is it harder?
So the difference in writing a series and writing like what we call in the business a standalone. I don't know why they call it that. It's just a novel. I don't know, standalone or whatever it is. I don't know. I wouldn't say necessarily. I think sometimes series books are harder, or they're harder for me because you never want to follow a template. You don't want somebody to go, oh my God, Ace's book 4 and the Quinn Coulson book was just like number 8. So kind of the pressure is on to make it new and unique, and to come to each book as if it could. I always would go with it, whether it was Spencer or it was Quinn. Would this book work if the character's name was John Smith? Is this an intriguing story, or are we just reading this book because Spencer is in it and somebody's dead and then whatever? But is there a theme to it? Are there characters in it? So it's a little bit tougher, I think, to keep a series going, to be honest with you. And I think the great thing about writing something that's totally different is there are no rules. I could do whatever I want to, whether it works or doesn't work, or it's good or bad. I'm just able to have fun with that world, and that's kind of nice too.
Patrick, a couple of good online questions. What's going on with Quinn Coulson? The online audience is pretty curious.
Well, whoever asked that question, that's a great question. Quinn Coulson, my series character who I love writing those books, and will be back at some time. So I don't know when. I'm under contract for a completely different kind of story. It's very difficult because we're all over the place. We're talking about Elvis and Cuban history and, Fatty Arbuckle and Dashiell Hammett. And if I told you what the next book is about, it would just blow your minds because it has nothing to do with any of this stuff. But I love those books, and I've invested over, 10 years of my life, a decade of my life, writing about this guy who comes home from war and becomes a sheriff in this rural county, and building relationships with his family and backstory. And so that will return hopefully soon.
Can you describe your a little bit of what it was like being on? I think it was No Reservations with Bourdain years ago with a Mississippi episode.
Yeah, that's a great question. You guys are good tonight. So yeah, I love that. Yeah, I got to hang out with Anthony Bourdain, who is just a wonderful person and a great guy. A very good friend of mine named Jack Pendarvis, who's a writer in town in Oxford, knew Bourdain, and he helped kind of orchestrate bringing Bourdain to do a No Reservations episode at the height of his popularity and coming to Oxford. And it was so funny. He had just come from Russia. And so they had been in Russia, and then he traveled with his crew of production people, and they came in. And I remember it was so cold in Oxford. It was like one of the coldest record-breaking times. And I was so sick. I had the flu and miserable, but I was like, there's no way I'm going to miss being on No Reservations with Anthony Bourdain. And so Jack, my buddy, assembled several of the local writers, and we went to City Grocery, this great bar, and we went in there and just hung out with Anthony Bourdain for, 3 hours. And we just sat up and we talked about the South and what it meant and family histories. And one thing I will tell you about that show is that part of the technique was to get you drinking. And the beer was it was like magic. It was like Harry Potter beer. I put the beer down and it was instantly filled back up because they wanted us talking. And then the next day, with a very bad hangover and the flu, we ended up going to a barbecue place and then sitting down, and I spent about 3 or 4 hours with him as well.
Was Megan Abbott there with you?
Megan was there. Megan, actually, who's from Michigan, but she was in Mississippi because who's a wonderful, wonderful writer and a dear friend. She was the Grisham writer in residence for that year, and so she was down there, and so it was Megan and then Jack Pendarvis and me and a buddy of mine, Tom Franklin, and a poet named Beth Ann Finley, and we just had a great time. And he was just a lovely guy. But it's so funny. I will tell you this. I think I've told you this about Bourdain. He was brilliant, and he loved stuff like this. He loved crime novels, and he wrote a crime novel, and he was very dismissive of it. He was like, I don't think it's very good, but I wrote this crime novel. But what he said is that when he would go to a city, when he was going to be traveling about it, he tried to find out who is their crime writer, because he said that's the way that I learn about a city. So even in Havana, I forget the writer who lives in Havana, very famous Cuban mystery writer, and Leonardo. Oh, really?
And at his house in Cuba.
Oh, wow. Well, so Bourdain really thought he was fantastic, and he said he learned so much about him. So even when he was traveling internationally, and somebody asked him, I think we were at the table when we were shooting this for 4 hours, and it's 10 minutes of footage you end up with. But at some point, people asked him, well, what do you read? What do you like? And he said his favorite writer of all time was Elmore Leonard. He said he loved Dutch Leonard. He said he loved everything he did. So, but he was a great guy, very warm and awful, very tragic.
He came through and signed stock here at the bookstore once, and he was doing a big charity luncheon thing, and he comes in, this big rip in his shirt, just reeking of cigarettes, and I got him talking about punk rock and CBGBs and. The New York.
That.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, the other loss I'll add on to that today was the news that Kinky Friedman had died. And did Kinky come here? Did he come and do book signings here?
No, never. Never.
Kinky
met him.
Friedman. Do you guys know Kinky Friedman? Kinky Friedman, great musician. Was kind of part of the scene in Greenwich Village back in the 60s.
Lasso from El Paso.
Yeah, he had songs like. They just don't make Jews like Jesus anymore. Put your get your biscuits in the oven, your buns in the bed.
Well, what was the name of his group?
Texas Kinky Friedman, the Texas Jew Boys.
That's it.
He was. I met Kinky when I was probably about 23 years old, and it was at a book event, and I hadn't published anything, and we just got to be good friends. And I think I blame Kinky in my habit of smoking cigars, and he showed up at this book event, and everybody, there's kind of a snobby scene where people are flying in from New York, and there's all this kind of thing, and Kinky shows up, and he's got a black duster on and cowboy boots and a big hat, and he's smoking a cigar, and he goes to nobody's touching the food. It's one of those events where everybody doesn't want to touch the food. He makes a turkey sandwich about this high, and then he goes over to the bartender and has him fill it up with Jack Daniels about that tall. And we just ended up sitting, talking, become good friends. Anyway, he was the first guy ever to blurb my novel. And so I sent it to him. I said, Mr. Friedman, and he's like, oh, hell yeah. And he read it. And I'll be honest with you guys, most people who sometimes blurb books, they actually don't read the books. And Kinky had read the damn book, and he was asking about it, and he really liked it. But he was a great person, and did a lot of. Kinky was probably in his mid to late 70s, but he did a lot of things for animal rescue, and just a hell of a guy. Kinky Friedman.
He had that kind of Captain Beefheart look.
Yeah.
Or wrapped in a Texas anarchist kind of package.
I don't know if those books are still in print, but he had a series of mystery novels, and his hero was Kinky Friedman. And so his protagonist was Kinky Friedman, and there's about 10 of them, and one of his great titles was Elvis, Jesus, and Coca-Cola, because he said those are the three things that everybody knows throughout the world is Elvis, Jesus, and Coca-Cola. And the books are hilarious. I mean, they're so funny. And I think on the last one, he got sick of writing them, and so he kills off Kinky Friedman.
Armadillos and Old Lace is another title.
So great. I collected them all. I just
Yeah.
love it. Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
PK, are there another online question?
That is it.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, I got to ask you. Okay, so
Sure.
we started the very beginning talking about, your first book, Crossroad Blues was the name of it. And it kind of went into the whole mythology of Robert Johnson, which is a whole, don't worry, we won't get deep into that subject. But, and then you wrote 3 more with Nick Travers, right? 3 more. Would you ever consider bringing him back? Or would you consider that as being a step backwards?
No, not at all. And I think it's, it's all
You've
the
done
same.
short stories.
It's all the same. I mean, I think I approach a novel in my own way now as an older writer and a more advanced writer, and I would bring something hopefully new to Nick Travers, which is, novels are essentially set in New Orleans, and I would love to write that character. They just recently re-recorded or recorded for the first time audio versions of those books, and the guy who's the narrator is a guy named Dion Graham, who is like Mr. one of the top on the Mount Rushmore of audiobook readers. He could do any voice. He's amazing, and he knocks it out of the park. And honestly, there had been some other versions, they were not very good. They had people reading like the Nick Travers book, and for some reason, sometimes when you write crime novels, the guys will read it like it's Sam Spade, and they read it like it's just terrible. And Dion Graham performs it. But anyway, it's rekindled my interest. And so yeah, I mean, if Morrow was, they had published a couple of Nick Travers books back in the day, and they would be good with continuing. Yeah, I'd do that in a second, man. Yeah.
Anybody have any thoughts before we wrap it up and have you sign some books?
Yep. We can talk about Elvis.
Elvis.
Do a little You should have brought some karaoke. That would have been a hell of a lot more interesting. We're doing talks, but this right here is just in the middle of it. I'll just do an Elvis song.
An Elvis song. Yeah.
There's a
We've got
writer who
one.
I won't name that would travel around with a guitar, and he was not very good, but it was his chance to have a captive audience, and so he would do songs in between his
Oh,
rings. So
really?
I would not subject you guys to that at all.
Christina had a question.
Oh, that's a tough question. Suspicious Minds is a great, yeah. I have to say though, it's so funny. So one of my very good friends, another writer, married the daughter of a guy named Dennis Lind, who is an extremely famous Nashville songwriter. If you look him up on Wikipedia, it's crazy all the stuff that he worked with, including Elvis, going to the Dixie Chicks, whatever. But he wrote "Burnin' Love," and so that's another great. But so many. I mean, Elvis could sing like, one of his crappy movies. He's singing "Old MacDonald had a farm," and it sounds fantastic, you know, because Elvis is doing it. But "Suspicious Minds," boy, that's a killer song. Yeah.
About well,
No. What is it?
I don't know. I mean, do you like Sun Records era?
Oh my God,
Elvis?
yeah, hell yeah,
that's
yeah, all
great
that stuff. That there's a terrific double album of everything that he did at Sun, and
Right.
it's just haunting and fantastic. Yeah, so spared and
stuff.
stripped down. Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you,
Let's give
guys.
Ace a
Thank you.
Nice warm welcome. Round of applause. You want to stay here? Yeah, if you wouldn't mind folding up your chair and kind of putting it against that wall over there.
John, you're such a pro. John's like I would love another water.